Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is psychoanalytic theory? So psychoanalytic theory is a talk therapy modality that was developed by Sigmund Freud, and it needs to be differentiated from psychodynamic theory. Psychodynamic theory includes psychoanalytic theory as well as the work that's been done since Sigmund Freud's work, so the Neo-Freudians. Psychodynamic theory, of course, uses many of the same principles we see in psychoanalytic theory, but they're not exactly the same thing. Now, the process of using psychoanalytic theory is referred to as psychoanalysis. That's the actual treatment. And it has several components to it that are fairly distinct from other therapeutic modalities. The first is the idea of levels of awareness. In psychoanalytic theory, there are 3 levels of awareness: conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. So the conscious mind contains information that someone's thinking right now. It's what they're aware of right at this moment. The preconscious mind contains information that is retrievable but not in conscious awareness. So a type of memory. It's information that somebody can readily access, but it's not going through their mind right now. And then we have the unconscious mind. Now, in psychoanalytic theory, the unconscious mind is the largest. It contains the most information. It contains information about frightening experiences, painful experiences, or drives or urges that are unacceptable to society. There's also a lot of other information in the unconscious mind as well. But that's really what we look at in terms of psychoanalytic theory, is it contains undesirable, unacceptable urges. Now, the key feature of the unconscious mind is that it's not accessible. So it's not like the preconscious mind, where somebody just has to think about it and retrieve those memories. The material in the unconscious mind is not directly retrievable. An individual is not aware of what's stored in the unconscious mind. In the psychoanalytic theory, all symptoms come from unresolved, unconscious conflicts. The next component we have is the psyche. And in psychoanalytic theory, the psyche is divided into 3 components. The first component to develop is the id, then the ego, then the superego. Now, the id is focused just on basic needs. The id doesn't have any regard for consequences. So, for instance, when we think of an infant in psychoanalytic theory, they are all id. It's all about meeting the basic needs. Now, the id has 2 components to it, 2 instincts. There's the Eros and the Thanatos. The Eros is the life instinct, the Thanatos is the death instinct. So the Eros is focused on survival. So it has components like eating, breathing, and having sex. Thanatos is focused on self-destruction. So again, it's the death instinct, violence, and aggression. Freud believed that the Eros was more powerful in most people than the Thanatos. So generally, people would move in a positive direction. They would move toward survival. Now, the next component to develop is the ego, but I'm going to come back to this in a moment and move to the superego, which is the last component of the psyche to develop. The superego contains morality. It's the rules of society. So it looks to satisfy those rules, to stay in line with those rules. Now, regulating the basic needs, the basic drives of the id and morality from the superego, we have the ego. So the ego is a mediator between the id and the superego. It functions on the reality principle. It tries to balance those basic needs with morality. When the ego fails, we have defense mechanisms, which I'll get to in a moment. So the next component of psychoanalytic theory is the psychosexual stages. And according to Freud, there were 5 stages of development: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. The genital stage was the last stage, and Freud believed this stage was entered in the late teens. So really his developmental model ends fairly early when compared to an entire lifetime. So as I mentioned before, according to Freud, all symptoms were because of unresolved, unconscious conflicts. These conflicts occur at these different psychosexual stages. They are unresolved conflicts within a stage. So the idea of any particular psychosexual stage is to successfully resolve the conflict that comes with that stage and move on to the next stage. When a problem occurs, in terms of a conflict not being resolved, a person can become stuck at that stage or have other problems even if they move on to another stage. When we look at how psychoanalytic theory is accepted or not accepted by therapists and how it's used, a lot of times we see that the psychosexual stages are not really accepted. The preferred model for, I think, many therapists would be Erik Erikson's model, which again is based on resolving conflicts, but it has more depth to it than we see with the psychosexual stages from Freud. I think that the idea of the conscious, preconscious, unconscious, the id, ego, and superego tend to make sense to individuals even if they don't necessarily believe in the theory. But the psychosexual stages probably take that a little too far for a lot of people to accept. It seems like an incomplete model of development. So I mentioned before that problems come about when the ego fails. That's when we see what we refer to as defense mechanisms. Now, Freud had developed a number of defense mechanisms, and in the psychodynamic theory, there are many more that were added. Now, defense mechanisms are thought to lower anxiety, but eventually can lead to dysfunction if they're overused, if the ego overdepends on them. And the whole idea of defense mechanisms is that material is in the unconscious mind, unacceptable drives and urges, and the ego is trying to find some way to deal with it. So the job of a defense mechanism is to protect the ego. So really all defense mechanisms are about putting material in the unconscious mind or keeping it there. So let's take a look briefly at a few of the defense mechanisms, a few of the popular ones. We have denial, and denial is when someone won't acknowledge something that's true. So when you think about denial in terms of psychoanalytic theory, the person really doesn't understand that whatever's true is true. The material that would help them understand that something is true is trapped in the unconscious mind. Next we have sublimation, and sublimation is when undesirable urges are converted into a useful career or a useful hobby. Then we have displacement, and one of the popular examples of displacement is when an individual is bullied and they develop aggressive feelings toward that bully, but they take out those feelings on someone who is not intimidating. So they're displacing that aggression intended for the bully to someone else. Next we have regression, and regression is tied in with these psychosexual stages. What happens with regression is that an individual moves to an earlier stage, and they adopt the behaviors that are consistent with that stage and potentially revisit the conflicts with that stage as well. So regression is moving back to an earlier stage of development. Now, fixation, the next defense mechanism, is when somebody gets stuck at a particular stage. So they stay within that conflict that's consistent with that stage and don't move forward. And then we have repression. So repression is really arguably the most important defense mechanism, because the goal of all defense mechanisms is to accomplish some degree of repression. Repression is when material from the conscious mind or the preconscious mind is moved over into the unconscious mind and a person becomes unaware of it. So repressed material is outside of a person's awareness. As I mentioned, there are a number of defense mechanisms. Those are just a few that I think are particularly important. Now moving on to the techniques of psychoanalytic theory. What techniques are used? Well, there are a variety of techniques. There were a few that Freud developed that he really emphasized, but actually psychoanalytic theory has a number of techniques, and there's a lot of diversity in these techniques. So the first one is catharsis. Now, catharsis is a technique that we see used in a number of therapeutic modalities, and that's where there's an emotional release. So sometimes with catharsis, we associate this with crying, but there's a lot of other feelings, emotions, and behaviors tied in with catharsis. The next technique is the interpretation of dreams. Freud really emphasized the importance of dreams because he believed that dreams allowed individuals to see unconscious material, to see material that was trapped in the unconscious mind. So dream interpretation, a key technique, and so was free association. Now, free association is when a person says whatever comes to mind. It's kind of a spontaneous type of technique, but Freud believed, like dreams, it helped a person to see unconscious material, that the material trapped in the unconscious mind would come out during free association. The next technique is resistance, and really in psychoanalytic theory, it's the analysis of resistance. So when people talk about unacceptable urges and drives, this material in the unconscious mind, this becomes uncomfortable, and they tend to resist the therapeutic process. Freud would analyze this resistance as he believed this also gave information about what's going on in the unconscious mind and could lead to a resolution of that conflict. The next technique is transference. And transference, in terms of the way Freud looked at it, was thought of as a type of resistance. It's when a client projects feelings they have towards somebody in their life onto the therapist. For example, if a client has a contentious relationship with their sister and they start treating the therapist as they would their sister. So transference just moves in one direction, from the client to the therapist. And in psychoanalytic theory, it's the analysis of the transference that's important, which again makes sense because it's a type of resistance, and the analysis of resistance is important. Now, countertransference is something totally different. Countertransference is not really a part of the treatment. It's considered destructive. That's when the therapist projects feelings onto the client. So in psychoanalytic theory, transference was valuable and was analyzed, and countertransference was avoided. That was considered destructive. A lot of times we see with other therapeutic modalities, the concepts of transference and countertransference are used. And usually they're conceptualized in a similar way. Transference can be useful and is really a natural part of therapy, and countertransference should be avoided because it has destructive potential. The last technique I'll cover here is interpretation. And really, interpretation for Freud meant interpreting all these different elements we see through the other techniques, like dreams and free association, resistance, transference. A lot of elements of a client's story would be interpreted. So they wouldn't necessarily be taken at face value, but Freud believed there was something else going on. There was something under the surface. So he would listen to the narrative of a client, but also think of what's going on in the unconscious mind. So a psychoanalyst, in essence, is always looking to interpret. They're always trying to dig a little deeper and see material that is hidden. So does psychoanalysis work? Is it an effective treatment of mental health symptoms? Well, this is a bit of a controversial issue. There is evidence available that demonstrates that psychoanalysis is effective in treating mental health symptoms. But there's not the same amount of evidence that we see with other more modern therapeutic modalities, like, for example, types of cognitive behavioral therapy. So psychoanalysis is in kind of a strange place right now, I think. It's accepted by a small group and used regularly, but most practitioners don't really integrate a large number of psychoanalytic techniques into their practice. Again, there are some areas of psychoanalysis which draw a lot of skepticism, like the psychosexual stages, but also even the idea of defense mechanisms. We have trouble there with research too. It's very hard to study and prove that something like a defense mechanism exists. So there's some controversy around psychoanalysis, but generally it's been found to be somewhat effective. The difficulty that psychoanalysis faces isn't just limited to how different it is as a therapeutic modality from a lot of the other popular therapies. Really, one of the problems is in how it's delivered. A lot of times when we look at modalities like one of the types of cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, we view it as a treatment that goes on for maybe 3 months, 6 months, potentially a year, sometimes a little more. Psychoanalysis is almost always framed in terms of the number of years. It's considered a treatment that would continue for a long time. It doesn't have a brief component to it, or even a component that keeps it in line with the amount of time spent in another modern modality. It's important when we consider psychoanalytic theory to take into account the immense and important contribution that Freud made to understanding human behavior, personality, and to talk therapy. Even though there are a number of people that disagree with how psychoanalytic theory conceptualizes all those things, the contribution was really quite important. We use different elements of psychoanalytic theory in a number of other theories, even if the essence of psychoanalytic theory isn't carried over. Also, a lot of the terms that Freud developed are commonly used now in other therapies as well. I think this is one of the reasons why psychoanalytic theory is still studied so much today. It's considered fundamental in training mental health clinicians. I hope you found this description of psychoanalytic theory to be interesting. Thanks for watching.